The That's very good. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another discussion with our dear brother Karim and Leslie Terabesi, otherwise known as Abdul Karim, and we're discussing the elements of the revisionist movement that's now a global phenomenon amongst certain of us who are academics and non-academics in the Muslim world. Brother Karim is an academic who's now stationed lives and works in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, where I was years ago. We knew each other previously, and now, by the grace of Allah, we're brought back together to try and shed some light on the errors that entered into Islam and within 100 years or so after the Prophet's death, peace and blessings be upon him. And the Prophet even mentioned as much. He said this, by the third generation after me, 100 years after me, he said, people are going to look like me, but they're not going to be of me. I'm paraphrasing a hadith, which is relatively accepted by most people. Not that I'm a hadith man, but these things, some of them seem to fit into the historical narrative, and others don't. And some fit into what is taught by the Quran, and others don't. Matter of fact, the majority of hadith do not fit with the Quran at all. And so, what Brother Karim and I are in the process of discussing is we're doing an apocalypse, if you will. Okay, an unveiling. That's what that word means. It means an unveiling of the man of sin. And when we talk about the man of sin, we're not talking about some beastie that's hiding in your closet or under your bed. We're talking about an entire organization of evil, political evil. And political evil often begins with a religious mindset, because the religious mindset is what establishes the culture of a nation. And so when we talk about the unveiling of the New Testament talks about the apocalypse, which is not this big end time war scheme, we're talking about the revelation of the man of sin. Who's doing this evil? Who's responsible for it? How did they do it? Where did it come about? Where did it begin? And what mechanisms did they use? You see. Well, the initial mechanism is infiltrating the words or the message that is brought by any one of the 124,000 prophets that have come to the earth, and then the people within 2 or 3 generations who want to take political control, they twist these words. You see, they twist it, they change it, they use subtle mechanisms which are considered in the world of the occult to be the ultimate form of magic, and that is to control the mind. That's what it is, to control the mind. So um, that's what's happening here. Now, we're talking about a school that is a contemporary school of thought, neoconservatism. And it began in, I think it was the University of Chicago, under a certain professor there. And he began to write and disseminate what he thought was a correct approach to the political management of a society. And just like Plato did. I mean, all of these philosophers did. They took up a certain position, and their positions weren't always wrong. And if they were wrong, it was a minor percentage of what it is that they considered the correct approach. There might have been a few steps here and there that were not exactly in keeping with what we might want to call divine order, but they're pretty close to it. Okay. So some people come in after these great teachers, whoever they might be, and they twist, you see. So um, I'm wondering, brother, what happened to the neoconservatives? How is it that they took a correct teaching and then twisted it? What did they twist, and how did it become the exportation of an evil mindset? a satanic mindset, if you want to use that word. I can poetically use some license here and make a new word, and export it to the world, and then use excuses like 9/11 and now COVID to, export this tyranny when that's not what was being taught to begin with at all, even by Plato, if we want to, go back to his narrative. So there's, 2,500 years between both narratives, and the same mechanism, the same kind of cult, the same kind of gang or club comes in behind these teachers, as they did behind Jesus, as they did behind the Prophet Muhammad, and twist the words, twist the doctrines, so that they can manage to take over political control of a cultural system that begins with some sort of religious belief, you see. So, what happened here at the University of Chicago 20, 30, 40 years ago? Please tell us.
Thank you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله. Well, okay, perhaps I should begin by making it clear that I actually don't know what happened at the University of Chicago. And there's a very good reason for that, which is simply that, well, I wasn't there, okay?
Mhm.
What I do know is that Leo Strauss was a teacher at the University of Chicago. But then again, so was Fazlur Rahman, you may
Yes.
recall.
Yes.
In fact, I wondered quite often, I still need to find out whether they ever met each other or knew of each other.
That would be interesting to know.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think in our last talk, Strauss was actually quite interested in Arab philosophers, Al-Farabi in particular. And, his, I think Farabi's commentaries on Aristotle were found very interesting. And I understand that Al-Farabi, with his commentaries on Aristotle, helped to bring Aristotle to Europe, to the Europeans. But of course, this was only, as a part of the, if you like, treasure trove of ideas that the Europeans, as it were, imported from the Muslims in those years. Because as you know, at that time, the Muslim civilization was, and this is admitted even by Orientalists and perhaps even some Islamophobes, that the Islamic civilization at that time was at its peak. They, Muslims, had the best scientists. They were the most progressive in the sciences and what have you. Even philosophy flourished, and there was a healthy discussion and debate. Ikhtilaf, which is the scholarly disagreement, was tolerated. Dogmatism or taqlid was something that only set in afterwards, probably due to political, pressures, as you mentioned. In this connection, I would like to mention a book by Professor Omar Ramahi. It's called he's a professor of engineering, I think, at one of the Canadian universities. I'm reading through his book these days, and the book is called, it's available on Amazon.com. It was published in 2019, and it is called Muslims' Greatest Challenge. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. I would recommend it alongside with Muhammad Shahrour's book they share a lot in common, I think. Shahrour's book is, he's not with us anymore. He died some years ago, but Shahrour's book was a big success when it was published, I believe, in 2007 in Damascus, Syria. But of course, it also aroused a lot of controversy. The 22 ulamas jumped on him, tried to disprove him or refute him or whatever is the right, debunk him or whatever is the word that people like to use. When I heard that, I figured he must have done something right. Otherwise, he would not have elicited such a response. And I believe he did get most of it right. I have not been able to find anything really that I could quarrel with, either in Shahrour's book or in Dr. Omar Ramahi's book. Although I have to mention I haven't quite finished with Dr. Ramahi's book, but I certainly recommend it to anyone who wishes to contemplate or consider an alternative narrative to the traditional narrative that we have all inherited, and that we are now experiencing a series of problems with, because because a lot of this traditional narrative seems, how do I put it, hard to believe or hard to accept. So,
Hard to swallow.
yes, well, you could put it that way too. Like, as far as food for thought is concerned, you could get a case of intellectual indigestion by reading some of the stuff.
Of course. Yes.
So you as a doctor, you know the dangers of
Oh dear.
physical indigestion. Just imagine how problematic the intellectual indigestion could be. And in fact, we do have something like an intellectual indigestion. People are finding it hard to swallow certain ideas. For example, that the Hadith is a revelation, or that it is equal to the Quran, or that it can abrogate, judge, and even replace the rulings of the Quran. These ideas are very difficult to accept because they imply somehow that human beings are able to, reveal, quote unquote, text that is comparable, to the Quran, which is very, very problematic because we as Muslims, I think, consider the Al-Quran to be, or the Mus'haf, which is the written transcript of the Quran, but I think I will use the word Quran here. We consider it to be the words of Allah. And so really, how can any human product compare to that? It cannot. And how could it be placed even above the Quran, and even in some cases overrule the Quran, as happened in cases of the punishments for blasphemy, apostasy, and adultery? All of these death penalties were taken from human-based narrations, the hadiths, and they basically overruled whatever Allah Ta'ala's legislated in the Quran on his. So I am just shocked.
Let me interject here just a minute. So these books that you are referring to are written by men who have taken a critical historical approach to the analysis of these aspects of what has become Islam.
Yes.
In the traditional perspective. So this is not just your opinion. This is the opinion of other people who have actually looked at the facts and looked at history and the development of these facts and the development of these various sectarian movements, the development of these various ideas, if you will. Okay.
Yes.
And what we're talking about here is, for example, how can I say it? An analogy would be to set up the Catholic catechism, if you would, and set that above the Bible or even the New Testament and say, well, this is what it really means, and we have the final say on it, and this is what you are to believe, and don't think about it anymore. I ran into this as a new Muslim, and I recognized it right away because that's what I was confronted with as a young man coming up in the Catholic system. I would ask questions and they couldn't answer the questions, and they said, just believe. You see, just believe. This is the tradition. This is how it is. You must trust us. And now what we're considering here, concerned ourselves with, is this narrative, which has proven untrustworthy. So we have a case of misplaced trust, and we're trying to correct that. And when you mention a reference, such as you've just mentioned by El Shahid or whatever his name was, then you are talking about a solid investigation. Typical. I mean, look, when you want to know who the criminal is, you've got to find out the evidence and you've got to find out the motivation, you see. And so in order to do that, you've got to have a very good detective. So these books are written by the equivalent of a police detective, an inspector, if you will. Okay. And if we want to just rely on tradition and the traditionalists, when you corner them, they're going to have the same response as a Catholic priest. Just believe, you see. Believe that Jesus is God. You see, that's just it. You see, so believe that Muhammad said this, despite the fact that 90% of the hadith have been proven to be fabrications. Oh my God. Well, this brings us to a conundrum, which has no solution other than revision, you see. And that revision is up to people like ourselves who just won't take belief for an answer. Because if you're going to have belief and no good reason for that belief, then how are you going to be able to discern, you see, what is right from what's wrong with respect to political motivations and then political deeds, you see? And when I'm talking about political, I'm just saying this, we're regarding a form of action. So we're talking about deeds, good deeds versus bad deeds. So we're either performing good deeds or bad deeds depending upon what we believe. So we have to get this sorted out. And I'm so happy and I feel so privileged to have these discussions with you, brother. And I just wanted to bring that focus to our listeners so that they don't miss the importance of what it is that you're sharing with us, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you. No, you are very right in bringing this to the attention of the viewers, because actually Al Quran reminds us regularly not to be deceived by shaitan. Because deception is a modus operandi of the evil, forces, and Allah Ta'ala has given us the critical mind to help us to differentiate between truth and falsehood. And He has given us Al Quran to help to guide us and also to differentiate truth from falsehood. So the procedure is actually not that complicated, but it assumes that you will, to begin with, that you are willing to use your akal, your mind or your intellect. Now, where the tradition is delivered a very serious blow to the rationalists is when they try to convince the people that to be a good Muslim, you actually have to shut your mind down. You have to, as you said, believe without asking why. And even amongst certain schools of thought, there's a popular saying, they like to say, we obey without asking why, okay? So now asking question has somehow become, a sign of a lack of piety. While the Quran, from beginning to end, uses expressions such as, yes, alunaka, they ask you, and then the answer comes cool. So Allah Ta'ala Himself uses the question and answer method in conveying His revelation to us.
Yes, he does.
But here comes some of the traditional ulama, and they want to prohibit questioning and even thinking. You see, so I see this whole movement as a massive assault on reason, and the tragic, what is tragic about it is that, as I have put in some of my publications, what is tragic about it is that I just don't see how any person can, be how do I put this? I don't see how any Muslim can understand the Quran, the guidance that is given to us, without using his or her reason. Is that possible? And if you cannot understand the revelation, well, how can you possibly follow it? So the prohibition of reason amounts to nothing less than an attempt, whether they intended it or not, the effect is to prevent or make it hard, very hard sometimes, for people to follow the revelation of the Quran, as the Prophet himself, peace be on him, was commanded, and as we are also asked to do, you see. So prohibiting reasoning is almost tantamount to a prohibition of understanding and following the Quran, and therefore it amounts to a prohibition of being or remaining a Muslim. This is just so anti what is taught us in the Quran. It is the complete reverse.
Yes.
So by the way, Omar Ramahi has an interesting explanation why this backlash against reason, how it originated. And I have commented on this as well, but let me first share his view on it. You see, as Islam was expanding and non-Arab people were becoming Muslims, such as the Persians and others, and some of these people came from cultures that, valued rationality significantly, and perhaps more so than some of the, tribal Arab people. And some of these people, according to Dr. Ramahi, may have felt threatened by that intellectual ability of the new converts.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
they began to withdraw into a form of tribalism,
Yes.
and they began to sort of say bad things about reason and rationality. And they even came up with a hadith according to which the Prophet allegedly said that anyone who uses his, according to the Prophet allegedly said that so-called quote, reason-based tafsir is a form of kufr or unbelief, end
Yes.
of quote. And they even had a name for the people, a derogatory term for the people who used akal. And
Mm-hmm.
they try to associate the use of akal with disbelief and with atheism. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, historically speaking, this was manifested in the political repression and mass murder of the philosophers in
Mm-hmm.
1786
Yeah.
by Musa al-Hadi, the fourth Abbasi caliph, the son of Mahdi, who actually initiated
Mm-hmm.
this pogrom or this persecution of thinkers 6 years earlier before this massacre took place. Allegedly, some of the persecution of the rationalists was continued even under Harun al-Rashid, and it was the rationalists really, rationalism really became the chief policy of the caliphate, I think, under al-Ma'mun, who was one of the two sons of Harun al-Rashid. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that this is an alternative, account of how this bias against rationalism arose. You may recall that by comparison, I was suggesting that as it were, the marginalization of reason took place as a result of the conflicts between the rationalists and the traditionalists,
Yes.
and the disputes between the two groups on the best way or the better way to interpret and understand the revelation of the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
So the rationalists wanted to use their akal, their intellect, their reason to understand the revelation directly without any intermediaries, which is what actually
Mm-hmm.
the Quran teaches, while the traditionalists did not trust akal, and they wanted to perceive the teaching of the revelation through the lens or the eyes of tradition, through
Mm-hmm.
the eyes of the Sahaba and the forefathers, and through the Hadith even.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, as Dr. Omar Ramahi points out in his book, this claim that the Hadith explain the Quran is very problematic because, at least from what he reported, there's not a single Hadith in the entire corpus that fully and comprehensively explains any verse in the Quran. And I have come across information in other sources, according to which a maximum of 15% of the Quran has any hadith that could be considered to be some kind of commentary on the Quran. So
Mm-hmm.
we have this huge problem of, I
Yes.
think, of misunderstanding revelation,
Mm-hmm.
misunderstanding the Quran, the main reason for this, the chief reason for this, I think, was basically the marginalization of reason, the repression of reason, the subordination of reason to tradition, the subordination of the intellect or the akal to the nakal, and which was later followed by, as we already mentioned, the persecution of the thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was later followed by a return to the persecution of the thinkers by al-Mutawakkil, who ended the era of rationalism, of the rule of the Mu'tazilites, who were, by the way, accused of being atheists.
Yes.
And then the waves against rationalism continued with even the official closure of the gates to ijtihad. In other words, the gates to juristic reasoning were officially closed. Even jurists or jurisprudents were not allowed to do any more thinking, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
The point was that, well, the previous scholars have explained everything we need to know for all time to come, so there's no need for any new ijtihad. You see, so this resulted in taqlid, a stagnation of Muslim thought, a dogmatism of sorts, and this was further reinforced by Al-Ghazali's attack on the philosophers in the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers.
Yes.
So this was very tragic because this anti-rationalism, I think, retarded the evolution of the Muslim community in several ways. One, which one should I begin with? Well, let me begin with the the retardation of the evolution of the arts and sciences. Okay.
Yes.
So many things became haram. You couldn't play a musical instrument. According to Al-Ghazali, if you heard a music coming out of any house, you had the right perhaps obligation, not, I need to check this, to enter the house by force and destroy someone else's private property, his musical instruments in his house. Can you believe this? This is absolutely shocking. I mean, how different is this from vigilante justice, from a Gestapo Nazi-like, modus operandi? I was really shocked when I read that.
It's a brown shirt mentality is what it is.
Well, yeah, brown shirt or whatever, black shirt or black flag mentality or whatever. You
know? yes, that's what it is, unfortunately. Yes.
In fact, speaking of black flags, I was recently texted by some fellow on Clubhouse inviting me to join a group of people for whom the black flags are very important. I couldn't believe it, you see, and they're waiting for the arrival of the Mahdi and what have you. I don't want to go into any more detail, but you can see that these kind of delusions still persist, among some of the Muslims.
To discuss that narrative at another case and another session.
Sure.
About the Mahdi. I think that's a very interesting topic that needs to be explored. But perhaps now, thanks for bringing it up. I would like to return to Leo Strauss and try and see if we can't draw parallels between what happened to his doctrine and what happened to Islam. You see,
yes.
It seems to me to be a pattern. You see.
Yes, very well said. I agree. I would just like to mention that Leo Strauss was apparently fond of telling his students that he quoted this one proverb, I think, from the Old Testament, which says that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
Yes.
That was one of his favorite expressions. He would always mention that to his people, his students.
That's in the book of Proverbs, I think.
Yeah, right. So anyway, about what happened here, you see, once again, how do I put this? Yes, his ideas or some, how do I put this? Some of the students that he had, and one example I mentioned was Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Undersecretary of State, or was it the Pentagon? I'm not sure now. He was one of the signatories of the Project for a New American Century, which called for an event comparable to a new Pearl Harbor to consolidate American public opinion behind the government to make possible the financing of a war in some Middle Eastern countries. And I believe there were up to 7 countries where people were planning to do a regime change.
Yes,
there was
one.
There was, I think, General Wesley Clark even has a video on that.
Yes, he did. He confirmed it.
So you see, this idea that you can stage an event or a false flag. By the way, false flags are very common, in history. Yeah, you know that. We don't have to go into that. But the idea that the U.S. government should somehow stage this kind of event in order to achieve or increase political dominance or hegemony in the broader world, to me, is profoundly un-American, quite frankly, the way I understand America, its principles. And also is this profoundly anti what Leo Strauss taught on this issue of Machiavellian politics. Absolutely. Yes. Like the very first sentence, because this whole staged event, 9/11, was actually a very Machiavellian event operation. You see, it's based on the assumption that the ends justify the means.
Yes.
Strauss showed, among other things, in his book called Thoughts on Machiavelli, which I recommend. I think is an excellent work. He demonstrated convincingly that this is a false, ends never justify the means. In other words, Machiavelli was dead wrong on this. And in fact, Strauss opened the opening sentence in his book runs something like this. I speak from memory, but I try to recall as accurately as I can. He says, I quote, but not totally perfectly, but as well as I can remember. He said, "We shall not surprise anyone we shall merely shock a few people and perhaps expose ourselves to ridicule or some ridicule if we profess ourselves inclined to the traditional view according to which Machiavelli was a teacher of evil. End of quote. You see. So Machiavelli, Strauss condemned Machiavellism and the so-called realpolitik. However, there are people that have tried to pin, the events of 9/11 on him personally, and I can mention Barbara Honegger. She had a video on YouTube which has since been taken down. When I tried to access it, it was taken down because the account was terminated. But it was something about the attacks on the Pentagon, and she claimed that this, whole 9/11 false flag was somehow she laid it at the door of Strauss's door as if he were responsible. That is a bunch of nonsense, and she wasn't
Well,
alone.
I thought that was the case years ago. That's why I'm pursuing this conversation with you, because you're saying, "Oh no, no, that's not what happened." So I want to get the roots of what happened, because lots of things have been blamed on Muslims because they say, "Well, this is what Islam teaches," and it's the same thing. You see, it's
Yeah,
analogous. Islam
yeah,
doesn't teach these things.
of course
Strauss
not.
did not teach these things. So who got in between the truth and the lie and the false actions, you see?
Well, there were people, I suppose, who wanted to. There are some people who don't care, you see, about
Hmm.
right and wrong. They are
Hmm.
willing to do anything immoral and unethical, and even against religion, as long as they think they reach their objectives. You
Hmm.
see, so I think this was a sort of a, what do you call? Some people call it I think you've referred to the hidden hand, and
Yes.
also the deep
Yes.
state. Some people use the expression the deep state. There was
Yes.
probably a group of people. In fact, I have a paper on it. I think it's still in academia, or have I
Hmm.
already? Because when I include a paper from academia on one of my books, I normally take it down from the research websites because
Yes. I've done the same thing. Yeah.
yeah. Amazon will not allow you to publish it if they think that you may have copied it from somebody else on the
Yes.
internet, even if it is you yourself copied
Yes.
from yourself. So I stopped doing that.
Yes.
But anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of research, a lot of evidence that this was a staged event. I
Hmm.
mean, so many Americans don't believe it. I could name names, but I think we don't have to. You probably know it. Richard Gage
Hmm.
and the engineers and architects for Truth 9/11. General Stubblebine, who was the chief
Yes.
of Army intelligence of the U.S. Army, for Pete's sakes, he came out. And there
Yes.
was another general, I think his name is Black, and also
Hmm.
the list is just very long,
Many,
right?
many.
Many,
So,
many.
what did people like Barbara do? Did they just take, okay, well, these were Strauss's students. This was their policy. So it's
Yeah,
Strauss's fault. It just made
yeah,
guilt by
yeah,
association. Is that it?
yeah. No, I think
No
probably
thought.
the, I
Mm.
think the probably the argument, if I recall correctly, the argument went like this: in the Republic, Plato does have the teaching of the so-called noble lie. We touched
Hmm.
on this before.
Yes.
I think what he was referring to was the religion of the Athenians.
Hmm.
I don't think he believed in the many gods, but for some reason perhaps because of what happened to his teacher Socrates, he didn't venture out into any open criticism of this
Yes.
polytheism,
Yes. Of course.
because after all, that was one of the charges against Socrates, that he was an apostate, you see.
Yes.
He apostatized from the polytheism of the Athenians, you see.
Hmm.
So, Plato might have also experienced some heat if he was openly critical of the polytheistic beliefs of the Athenians. And remember what
Hmm.
Aristotle said when he escaped from Athens and went to join and became the teacher of Alexander the Great under Philip in
Yes.
Macedonia. He said he left Athens because he did not want Athens to sin against philosophy for the second time, you see.
Ah. Yes. Yes.
So this
Yes.
was we have here an archetypal tension between the thinker or the dissident and the
Yeah.
majority, you see, between
Yes.
between wisdom and power. You see?
Yes, yes.
So wisdom has to take steps to protect itself. Now, in the case of Socrates,
Well, power
you
should
can
be protecting wisdom, but when power corrupts, then this is what
exactly,
happens. Yeah.
exactly. So now, for instance, in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, we have a rare example of where the power and the wisdom and the guidance is combined in a single person. So he
Mm.
did brilliantly. But what
Yes.
about the people that came after him? Could
Hmm.
they keep up the work in a way that he did?
Hmm.
Well, what happened after his demise? Suddenly we have a whole bunch of conflicts and civil wars
Hmm.
happening. Sahaba against
Hmm.
Sahaba.
Yes.
15,000 Sahaba died, according to Shahrur, in the first fitna alone, which was
Hmm.
consisted of two battles, the Battle of the Camel and the Battle of Siffin. So what happened, you see? And then we have, of course, the Sunni Shia divide that came afterwards and a few other fitnas. But to come back to Strauss once again, I think he was unfairly blamed for this because people may have felt threatened by what they may have perceived as his so-called authoritarianism, because
Hmm.
people, as you know, in the West, and I lived in Canada for 19 years, people in the West, the moment you use an expression like this is the truth or the absolute truth, they will look at you
Hmm.
like kind of funny. You mean you believe in absolute truth? As if
Yes.
it was some kind of a elementary error that you are. So I'm not saying that Strauss never used the expression absolute
No.
truth. But Hegel did, for example. But
Hmm.
anyway, Strauss did talk about the difference between right and wrong, and he differentiated between justice that is trans-historical and transnational, which was based on what he called natural right, or what is right by nature, you see, just by
Hmm.
nature, and history, and history, because in history the conception of what is fair and just changes as the time passes by, right? But
Yes.
there is a universal standard of justice, and that we find this idea also in the Quran. Allah says, at least in at least three different places, we will never find a change in the words of Allah. They don't change.
Yes.
And the Sunnah of Allah also does not change. So
That's
there's a
pretty
certain
absolute.
right. So I think people may have felt threatened by this perceived absolutism, if you like. I don't think that's
Hmm.
quite the right word. It doesn't quite do justice to it. Just because you believe in a difference between right and wrong, that does not make you an absolutist or a totalitarian or a dictator, if you see what I'm
Yes,
saying.
of course. Of
But
course.
that was the perception among some people, you see. And
Hmm.
Barbara Honegger wasn't alone. And by the way, she's a pretty sharp lady. She's
Hmm.
very intelligent, except I think she got it badly wrong on this issue with Strauss.
I see.
But anyway, she worked, by the way, in the White House for two presidents. I think she was, quite close to two of the former presidents.
Hmm.
I think who was it, Reagan and maybe Bush. I need to check
Hmm.
that. But anyway, yes, this is unfortunate because people's words become distorted, and the followers of leaders very often transgress and they go too far. And we
Hmm.
don't have to go very far to find this also in Muslim intellectual history, because
Uh-huh.
the Quran teaches that waging jihad, is permitted only in two cases. One is self-defense, and two is fighting against persecution.
Hmm.
It does not, endorse any kind of aggressive war known as jihad al-talab, and but in other words, it does not allow spreading Islam by the sword.
Hmm.
But this is what the concept of aggressive jihad al-talab, says. The
Hmm.
ulama, and almost without exception, I could not find a single name among the leading ulama who
Hmm.
actually rejected this notion of jihad al-talab. They almost, to a man, accepted it,
Well, this is
meaning that, yeah,
analogous. This is analogous to winning hearts and minds for democracy, correct?
yeah,
By
spreading
any means.
Islam, yeah, spreading Islam by the sword or spreading democracy by the cruise missile. Sure,
Yes, yes,
there's a
it's
there's a concept of manifest destiny here
yes,
in
of
both
course.
cases. I remember
Yes,
reading about
yes,
manifest destiny in my history
yes.
course years ago,
Mhm.
and then I realized, well, the Muslims, some of the Muslim ulama had also a similar concept, manifest
Yes.
destiny. And they also came up with this concept of the clash of civilizations. They had
So
that too.
the errors made are the same. They're the
Same,
same errors.
exactly.
You,
Yeah.
you can change the name of the error, but it's still the same error.
Absolutely. So the conflict of clash of civilizations they had a different name for it. They said it's a clash between the Darul Islam and the Darul Harb, the abode of Islam, the abode of war. Sometimes the abode of war was referred to as the Darul Kufr, the abode of disbelief. And they believed that there was this inevitable clash, like Said Qutb used to argue, and some of the Islamists also argue. I believe Maududi is among them, and even Ibn Taymiyyah. So these people, and but unfortunately, even some of the traditional, well, not some, nearly all traditional ulama subscribe to this doctrine of jihad al-talab, and that does not exclude even al-Ghazali. You see, he
Yeah.
also supported the doctrine of jihad al, and so did Mawardi. And so I found a passage in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah where he also endorses it. And Ibn Rushd says, in one of his writings, that in fact all the major jurists endorse this idea that the Muslims are required to spread Islam by the word and by the sword if necessary, and they are required to fight against non-Muslims to spread Islam even when the non-Muslims are not fighting against the Muslims. Now,
I
this
see.
is catastrophic.
It is
So to
catastrophic.
so to me, you know, the Nuremberg Code says that the aggressive war is a crime, right?
Yes.
So it definitely wouldn't. But Allah also says that this kind of there's makes it clear that aggressive warfare is not permitted. It is a crime. In
Yes.
fact, I referred to this, and I have put it in writing, to this idea that the community is required to go wage war on non-Muslims once a year. They made it into a sixth pillar of Islam, as I mentioned last time. This
Yes. Yes.
idea that
That
the Muslim,
surprised me when you made that statement.
yeah.
That
So,
was a revelation to me.
so I was, you know, I think of it, this notion of waging aggressive jihad on people who have no hostile intentions towards you, who are not fighting against you.
Yes.
To
Yes.
me, I please help me out, but I don't see much difference between that and what some people call state terrorism. Please correct me if I'm
Yes.
missing anything.
No, no, that's the same. It seems that what happened here is that the people who believed in manifest destiny of the West, for example, or wanted to use that idea for their purposes, for their ends, they used the noble lie that they attributed to Leo Strauss, and then laid it at his feet so that they could prosecute this noble lie and then take over what Russia and China seem to be taking over with respect to the landmass extension of their road from, the Far East, Japan, all the way through to Constantinople. They wanted to prevent this and keep it in the Western autonomy. But is that really the true motive? I don't think so. I think that just sets up another um, uh, dichotomy, another narrative, another polar opposite, so we can maintain the tension, because the pure end here is the global governance, which stands above all of this. So what they were doing, they used the noble lie to create this contention so that they could then position everybody to surrender to regionalization under a global governance, which was not possible before this time, especially since the Freemasons created the first international institutions these last 300 years under the Commonwealth, which is now what we call the Commonwealth nations, and that's the largest corporation to ever exist in the face of in the history of the world. And most people don't understand this or comprehend it. I mean, it's bigger than Microsoft and all these others. And if you look at Google, for example, all right, I was just discussing this in the seminars I'm giving. The Google logo is the Freemasonic apron. See this M. That's what it
Small
is.
world.
Yes, a small world. So they're closing the borders of the world in order to establish this global governance, and they use this noble lie that they lay at the foot of Strauss when it's actually something else completely. Okay, so before we go any further, can you make a few comment or teach us what the real essence of this noble lie actually is or was in the minds of those who did propose it. For example, what did Plato say about it? What did, other philosophers down through the ages have to say about it? And what did Strauss have to say about it? And how did it get twisted? Okay.
Yeah, well, I would first suggest that to get a good understanding of Plato's notion of the noble life, probably one couldn't do better than read Plato himself on the issue,
Yes, of course.
which I have done, but it has been some time ago. But if I
Mm-hmm.
recall correctly, he was suggesting that the so-called noble lie was required for the masses, you see, because
Mm-hmm.
the masses needed some kind of a narrative to keep them united and to. But here I might be skating on thin ice because, like I said, it's been some time. But like I said,
Mm-hmm.
I interpret the noble lie as him basically going, him basically saying that we should not challenge the multiplicity of gods that the Athenians believed in at the time. That was the lie that he was somehow he felt that he didn't want to challenge that lie. Now, that's from a Muslim point of view, that was definitely not a noble lie at all.
Yes.
However, as we know, he was not a Muslim, and so. But like I say, I would say that the best thing to do is to read it. But we have, I mean, we have so much deception going on even in the West. The official channels of communication, CNN and what have you. Can you
Yes.
trust these outlets to tell you the truth, or are we getting noble lies practically on a daily basis? We are
Yes.
saturated with lies. I wouldn't call them noble. It's probably not right to do that.
Yes. Yes.
I think the reason he used the word noble in front of the word lie is because it had some usefulness. You see, they were
Mm-hmm.
to keep the masses content, or to pacify them. To keep them
Mm-hmm.
becoming upset, because as you know, people can react very violently when you begin to challenge their gods or critique
Yes.
their
Of
gods.
course.
They are very
Mm-hmm.
strongly attached. Look what happened with Ibrahim alayhi salam when he,
Mm-hmm.
destroyed the gods, except the biggest one. The people, they tried to burn him, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
look
Yes.
what happened to Prophet Muhammad when he preached the message of monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
People tried to
Yes.
kill him too. You see,
Yes.
so
Of
when you
course.
challenge these very basic beliefs, and now we have certain ulama, have they been idolized in some cases? You see, this is another issue.
Mm-hmm.
That when we say we cannot critique any of the leading imams, and in fact the imams, the traditional ulama, basically stated for the record that anyone who disagrees with them or takes a different opinion from theirs has
Mm-hmm.
left the fold of Islam. They
Okay.
basically, if you disagree with the leading alim, you have become an
Mm-hmm.
apostate, and you know what follows. What's supposed to happen to people who leave Islam?
Okay. So that means that even if you know that what they're stating and what the people are following is a lie, it's a noble lie because if you leave it alone, you maintain peace. Is it something like that?
Yeah, something like that. Now I know it's not a very
Yeah.
credible argument, but
No.
in
Okay.
the Quran we have a verse in Surah 16, verse 125, where Allah gives us a clue of
Mm-hmm.
how to speak to people. You see, and I put that
Yes.
quote in my book. And Sheikh Imran was reading it when he was looking over my book some years ago when he was here. The verse says, "Speak to them in the best way." You see, when you
Mm-hmm.
do, talk to them about it. So what is this best way to speak to people? You see. So
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we Muslims can and should tell the truth, but we should do it in the best way. You see. So
Mm-hmm. Okay.
before we can do it in the best way, we need to know what is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm confronted with this challenge every day in my
Mm-hmm.
writing. Is this the best way that I can put this point? You see, and some of my
Yes.
papers have gone through endless revisions, brother. It's just unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yes.
I think one of my recent last papers at the institute where I worked as a research fellow, the paper on reconciliation of reason and revelation in education,
Mm-hmm.
it went through about 700 drafts, believe it or
Oh
not.
my God.
I mean, revisions, I should say.
I know where you're coming from.
Exactly. You're a book writer too, so you know exactly what I'm
Yeah.
writing, what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. So it's a very delicate thing, because languages can be very tricky, and the same word may mean two different things to different people, you see.
Yes, yes.
So because, I mean, every reading is an interpretation, even if you read the text in your native tongue, because everybody reads whatever they read in light of their prior experience and knowledge, and of course they may respond to it differently.
Well, that's one approach to the noble lie. There's another approach here that I think is more commonly understood, and that is, okay, so we have 9/11, we blame it on the Muslims, that's the noble lie. And that allows us to go invade their countries and destroy the final enemy to our ultimate goal, which is world government. That's a noble lie as far as they're concerned. I'm not sure that Strauss would have endorsed this.
No, he wouldn't.
Okay, well, elaborate on that then.
Yeah, you see, to get to the real motive for this, there's an interesting interview on YouTube with Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, and this English chap, and they're talking about the real motive of why these wars are being waged. And Ken Livingstone pointed out the simple fact. He referred to the war in Ukraine and said that, look, the military-industrial complex is making a lot of money out of this conflict.
Yes.
Because these people are sending, U.S. government is sending all this military hardware to Ukraine. That costs money. Somebody has to pay for it.
Right.
And then once this equipment is sent, it has to be replaced. And whoever is going to be replacing it is going to be looking at some hefty profits, you see.
Yes, of course.
So the military, industrial complex, which we were warned against by Eisenhower already, to get a hand in glove with NATO, basically this is enriching a group of super rich persons and companies. So basically what we are looking at is profits. And even in Iraq, who was supplying the services for the US troops during the Iraqi occupation? Well, there was a company called Halliburton, and who was at one time the chief officer of this company. Does the name Dick Cheney ring a bell? You see, so this is not rocket science. This is about money.
No, it's not,
bro. It's about
It's
money
not.
and
But
control and power.
even if you look at the chain of command here, you never get to the puppet master. So that means you might be able to lay your eyes on someone like Cheney, but there's always a master above him. So from my perspective, from what I've understood of the history of this organized evil, this study of ponerology, if you will, God bless Dr. Lobachevsky for writing that book. If you haven't read it, please, you should add it to your library and study it, because it's very necessary to become informed at this moment in time. Okay, in particular. So I think we've covered quite a bit of space there, dear brother, regarding Leo Strauss and what happened with the neoconservative and the noble lie and the different approaches to understanding what the noble lie might be. We may not be definitive in that matter, but at least we open the box and allow people to think about these things if they're tuning in to listen to us and see, well, this isn't something that just happened to Western democracy. This also happened to what we recognize as Islam early on, and it repeatedly happens. There's some sort of lie that's always lurking there, and there's also some sort of a gang that's promoting that lie, and they're twisting the words of their teachers, the ones who were sent to instruct them, and internally put their thought process together for the purposes of good. Well, if their intentions are selfish, they will take those doctrines, they will take those principles, they will twist them, and then use them to create some form of noble lie, which is going to cause the masses to run out, put their uniforms on, or get their black flags or whatever it might be, and go start killing the wrong people. People who are strangers, people who have no intentions of harming them. And yet they will go into their house and destroy their musical instruments just because somebody said so. thousands or hundreds of years ago. Let's go do it. It's the Sunnah. Well, is it? Brother, any other comment you would like to add there before we close?
Yeah, perhaps I can just add one more thing. You know, we have this noble eye. Actually, we have something akin to it even in the Hadith literature. I don't know if you recall that Hadith where apparently the Prophet said, peace be on him, that it's okay to tell a lie if the effect is beneficial. For example, I can lie to my wife if it makes her feel better. This is incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's there. So it is, we call them white lies sometimes, but we can call this a noble lie, but it is still a lie, you see. And the idea that the end justifies the means actually is also very strong, present in Islamic traditional Islamic jurisprudence, you see. There's this concept of saddu zaraya, which is, in English, it is rendered as blocking the means, which is one of the sources of the law according to traditional scholars. And basically it says that an act can be declared to be illegal if that act can lead to another act which is illegal. You see what I'm saying? Now, the key word here is can lead to it. It does not necessarily have to lead to it. So we have, for example, a crime of close proximity, which has being alone with a woman who is not your relative in a secluded place, was declared a crime of close proximity by the ulama, despite the fact that Allah Ta'ala never made any such prohibition. What he prohibited was zina or adultery, you see. He did not prohibit being alone with a person who is not a family member, being with that person together in the same room. So they criminalized what is basically inappropriate behavior. This is a very, very troubling development, you see.
Well, you might want to discourage that kind of behavior, but you don't have to criminalize it, for God's sake.
Exactly. So now we have that in Iran now. They have criminalized not wearing the hijab. It's the same thing.
Yeah, they're killing the women over there.
Exactly. So yeah,
they're
I
literally
don't.
killing them, for God's sake. This is zealotry. I mean, this is extremism.
Fanaticism also, I would add.
The Iranian prime minister just the other day has the gall to say Iran's never been stronger. Iran's never been stronger. And your police are going out on the streets and braining beautiful, young, innocent women because they don't want to wear the hijab. This is not the greatest accomplishment of any nation. You see, this is savagery. This is the release of savagery. And that's actually what took place after 9/11, isn't it? The release of savagery, and it took place again in Vietnam, the release of savagery. So this means we're not in control of our actions at all at the national and even international levels. So who's controlling this? Whoever's promoting and propagating a lie? Yeah, it seems that way.
Well, my response to that would be, brother, is that there's an interesting verse in Al-Quran where Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. It means they plotted and planned, but Allah also plotted and planned. And Allah is the best of planners. End of quote. So no matter how delicate or deep or intricate the plot of your Freemasons or whoever is sitting at the top of this pyramid is, they will never be able to outsmart Allah. They will never be able to plan better than Allah. And He will bring them down. It's just a matter of time. Because it has always happened in the past. And we will never find a change in the Sunnah of Allah. So these people are deluding themselves if they think that they can succeed against Allah's plan. Allah's plan is strong, is another verse that says that.
This is true. But the savagery, nevertheless, is true and it has its effects.
For some reason, He allows it to happen. He could put a stop to it, but for some reasons known to Him, He allowed it to happen. Sometimes He intervenes and stops things from happening, and sometimes I think He lets it happen. Now, we could speculate on those reasons, but perhaps this is the time or place to do it. But I do believe that Allah Ta'ala is ultimately the one in control.
I agree with that. I agree with
Nothing
that.
can happen without his permission or his command. If he
Yeah,
commands it, it happens.
true.
If he lets it happen, it's not like he wanted this evil to happen, but he, for some
Yeah.
reason, he lets it happen, and we cannot blame him for these evil deeds, because there are many verses in the
No.
Quran
Oh
which say
no,
that
not at all.
these bad things that are happening to you are happening to you because of what your hands sent forth, right?
Yes,
Not what Allah. Yeah,
this
exactly.
is an absolute truth. It is an absolute truth. There's no doubt about that. So, dear brother, let's make an end there. And I would like next week if we could take up and return to um, the origins of the Fatimid Caliphate and what happened. How did this come to oppose the Sunni position, and why did they last for as long as they did until Salahuddin tore them out of Cairo and wherever else they were insinuating themselves? How did that come about? So, if we can turn our attentions there and then continue with this historical narrative that will help our listeners to better understand the history of what has become known as Islam in the Muslim world, I would appreciate that. So, thank you once again, dear brother, for
And thank you too.
taking this time to share with me, and enjoy the rest of your
My
evening.
pleasure. Same to
And
you, brother, and thank you for having me.
inshallah, we'll see you again next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.